Hello and welcome to my channel Lifestyle and Fashion Tea. And on this channel we talk about everything from fashion to reaction. Today I want to get into where is Sudiksha Konanki. She went on spring break to Punta Cana with friends.
St. Cloud State student is still
And she has not returned. And this is 10 days so far that she has been missing. Let's take a listen.
10 days ago. Fox 9 So Young Kim joining us in our newsroom now. And So Young, his parents are speaking out through their attorney at this point.
Kelsey, Randy, his family says he's being detained in the Dominican Republic despite his willingness to cooperate. This surveillance video shows what authorities say our 20-year-old University of Pittsburgh student Sudiksha Konanki and 22-year-old St. Cloud State University student Joshua Reeby in Punta Cana. They can be seen together on camera not too long before she vanished in the early hours on March 6th. Dominican Republic police say Reeby is considered a witness as the search for Konanki continues and say this is a missing person investigation, not a criminal case at this time. Now, his parents are speaking out through an attorney saying, quote, despite his full willingness to cooperate, Josh has been detained under irregular conditions and subjected to extensive questioning without the presence of official translators or legal counsel until Wednesday, March 12th. They also say he has remained in his hotel room under police surveillance. According to a police interview transcript obtained by Fox News, Reeby says they met that night, then made their way to the beach. The two were talking in the water when a big wave hit. He struggled to help her ashore. Then at some point he threw up and passed out. Several hours later, he returned alone to his hotel room. His family also asked everyone to pray that Sudiksha be found and returned home to her family. And according to the police transcript, there are some questions Reeby has been advised by his attorney to not answer, like how he felt about the situation or if he told anyone about what happened. Live in the newsroom tonight, So Young Kim, Fox 9.
The Rio Republica resort the night that she went missing. The group went to one of the bars at the resort, had some drinks. It's an all-inclusive, and then he says that someone suggested they go to the beach. And that's where we can pick up the surveillance video of those moments. The same TV station that got the transcript, Noticias SIN, first acquired this surveillance video. Now, the video shows that Reeby has his arms around Sudiksha with their friends making their way to the beach at 4:15 in the morning. Reeby says when he got to the beach, he took off his shirt, his socks, and his shoes. Then at 5:55 a.m., we see most of that group heading back to the hotel, leaving Reeby and Sudiksha behind. Reeby says that he and Sudiksha went into the water where they kissed. This is again from the transcript of his interview with authorities. He says the water reportedly was about waist high, and he says then they were hit by a wave and carried out to sea. Now this beach, it has been known to have some dangerous surf. In fact, 4 tourists who were staying at this same resort earlier this year all died in a drowning. Reeby told investigators that he and Sudiksha called for help, but since this was the early hours of the morning, there was no one there to help them or hear them. They then tried to swim, and Reeby said Sudiksha was getting tired. We translated this report that was in Spanish by Noticias SIN into English, and this is what Reeby reportedly told investigators next. Quote, I was holding her under my arm and swimming to get her out of the water. The investigator asked, what happened next? He replied, quote, it took me a long time to get her out. It was hard. I've been a lifeguard in pools, not in the sea. I was trying to make sure she kept breathing at all times. I couldn't breathe the whole time and swallowed a lot of water. I could have passed out several times. When I finally touched the ground on the beach, I placed her in front of me. Reeby then says Sudiksha got up to grab her belongings and walked at an angle along the beach in knee-deep water. He says he asked if she was okay as she was walking away, but he never heard her answer because at that moment he started throwing up from all the seawater he says he swallowed while swimming to safety. When he finished vomiting, he looked up and says Sudiksha was gone. Reeby then says that he felt exhausted from that swim, so he laid down on a beach chair and fell asleep. It wasn't until the sun came up the next morning and he was being bit by mosquitoes that he said he woke up. This again, all from this transcript with investigators. The next time we would see Reeby on the surveillance video is right here, around 9:55 a.m. as he is walking back to the hotel from the beach. You can see his shirt is off and he doesn't appear to have his shoes on. Then there's part of the report that needs a little more clarification. According to Noticias SIN, Reeby tells investigators when he returned to the hotel, he went to his friend's room to get his phone, then went to his own room to sleep. But then at the end of the interview, he says, quote, "The next day I found my things because I never picked them up, but someone had stolen my shoes and the key card to my room." He never mentions having to go to the lobby to get a new key, so there's the question there of how he was able to get into his room to then sleep. Then you have the final moment that he said he saw Sudiksha. He said that she went to go get her things walking at an angle in knee-high deep water before he started throwing up. Sudiksha's clothes were found on a beach chair by search crews this week. Reeby also said that Sudiksha was kissing him as they walked to the beach, and that's not something that we were able to see in the Noticias SIN surveillance video. Then comes the part of the interview where Reeby reportedly refuses to answer several questions. Investigators reportedly asked, "How can we verify what you said is true?" Reeby reportedly replied, "My lawyers advised me not to answer that question and I will rely on them." Reeby reportedly used that response to several more questions in this interview with law enforcement. The questions included, quote, "What do you think about the disappearance? Did you know the young woman? Do you remember if the young woman made any gestures or screamed while in the sea? Did you report to authorities or the hotel what happened with you and the girl on the beach? Did you tell your friend what happened with you and the girl on the beach?" All which the report says he answered, quote, "My lawyers advised me not to answer that question and I will rely on them." The report said investigators told Reeby that he did have a right not to answer questions. He also said he didn't remember how long they were on the beach for because he didn't have his phone or how long they were in the water. Reeby said he was sleeping in his room when his friend asked if he had seen Sudiksha and he said he hadn't and thought she had gone back to her room. It's important to note, once again, that Josh Reeby is not a suspect and this is not a criminal investigation, and it does appear that he has been cooperative in the more than a week since Sudiksha went missing. At the time of this recording, it appears he is still in the Dominican Republic. And we've seen video like this from Noticias SIN showing Reeby with investigators. And there are pictures of him speaking with police on the beach. Interpol, the International Police Agency, just issued a yellow notice for Sudiksha Konanki, which is a global alert that they put out for missing persons cases. Well, ABC News earlier this week put out a report saying that Dominican authorities believe that Sudiksha Konanki drowned in the ocean. Authorities have also said that they are not ruling out any possibility. Her father, who has traveled to the Dominican Republic from their home in Virginia, has called on authorities to do more to investigate the possibility of a kidnapping or an abduction. Joining us now to talk more about this is former NYPD detective and host of the Gold Shields podcast, Tom Smith. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Interesting to read through this transcript that was first released to this Dominican television station. You've been in many interviews before, and when lawyers are present, again, he's not a suspect. He's just a witness, according to Dominican prosecutors. What stands out to you?
Yeah, you know what stands out is the detail that he remembers certain parts, but then when he gets pressed on other parts, he kind of deflects to his lawyer, which to me is always a red flag, because if you're seriously concerned about someone you were with literally minutes or hours ago that is now missing, and you would have no involvement with it, you'd be more forthcoming. And that's not the case. He goes through just the details of the wave and pulling her out of the water and then her kind of walking sideways and then forgets everything else after that. That, to me, as an investigator that has done thousands of interviews, a red flag for me.
Yeah, because part of me looks and says he's in a foreign country, doesn't understand the laws there. You get a lawyer to help you, which is certainly your right. But it was like some of the I understand that there might be some civil action potentially one day down the line if maybe he didn't report it to the authorities of what had taken place on the beach. I mean, what could be the motive for not answering some of those specific questions that were put out in this interview?
Yeah, there could be a number of reasons. One, let's go with the innocent part, that he's scared He doesn't want to get in trouble for something he didn't do. You know, you could get very wrapped up into leading an investigation in a certain direction by just your statements of pointing the finger at you. And let's just say that's not what the case is. But the other part is being involved in one way or another. Did she meet somebody else after that? Did someone else approach them? You know, those are all factors that are part of this investigation. And him being the only person in that area, as you know, to this day that we know of, you know, his testimony, his interview, and his statements are very, very important. So if you're not involved, you would want to do everything you could and say everything you could to help the investigation, not deflect to your lawyer, which he did towards the end of this.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well, because the questions were, it was like, when did you tell your friend about what happened? I think was one of the questions, which seems like a pretty, you know, the X's and O's of the day and what took place. And now, too, when I look at the timeline, because originally, and a lot was through media reports, ABC News has that last week that this was going to be investigated likely as a drowning, that they had been taken away by a big wave. And then that seemed to be the point that we last saw her. Now it's this image that he lays out of he was getting sick. He, right before he threw up, looked up and saw her walking away in knee-deep water, and then that's it. If you're an investigator, how do you approach that? Because that seems to open up a whole new world of possibility of what potentially happened after.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go into, you know, creating a timeline. One of the first things I thought of, and growing up sometimes down the Jersey Shore as a kid, was what was the tide like? What was the ocean like at that time? And you can pinpoint whether it's high tide, low tide, or whatever it might have been, the history of big waves in that area. You know, there's some resorts, as you know, that don't have, you know, that ocean-like feeling of a regular beach with the tide. So that's going to be part of it. You know, and then the other interviews are going to be very important in this with, like you just mentioned, who did he talk to afterwards? What did he act like? What was his demeanor? You know, those are going to be all compelling factors when it comes to creating even more of a timeline with this. But it's going to be interesting going forward, especially with other interviews that are going to be conducted about how he acted, what he said, you know, what his actions were afterwards.
One other piece, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because I know people are circling it as part of the transcript that's been released through these media reports, is the fact he says he went to his room and went to sleep, but then later says that his key card had gotten stolen from the room. Like, that to me is like something there needs to be more clarification. And again, this is a missing persons case, but just as a story's being laid out, how do you get into your room if you don't have your key card? And then he doesn't mention like going to a hotel lobby like everybody has in the past when you lose your room key.
Right. And that goes into, you know, my way of thinking with this is, we've had this conversation on your show with other cases. When crimes are committed, not saying he is, but just generally, when situations occur and crimes are committed, to give your initial alibi of what happened sometimes is very easy. You come up with a story, you stick to it, there's no one else around, so there's no one to dispute it. But then when you start getting questioned about actions that take place afterwards, you're not prepared for those questions. And that's when, you know, people get tied up with their statements of what happened after events, when they start to get questioned, because people can't anticipate detectives questioning or investigators questions, you know, when they're kind of thinking of their alibi. And that might be the case here. And that's why follow-up interviews are going to be very, very important with this. Even if his lawyer's there, having to lay out what you think you have, and maybe some additional evidence that you can throw at him to see how he reacts to it.
I also wonder, too, because he talks about that she went to go get her things and she was in knee-high water, but then her clothes were found on the beach. That to me is just something that's, I found that surprising. I mean, you're the former detective. I'm just kind of like sitting back and like reading this, and it's like, that's interesting because they found this piece of clothing. And then I also think of, you know, he goes and falls asleep on the beach, where that was it sounded like a pretty traumatic event that he had gone through, having to drag her out of the water. I mean, it sounds like it was a near death experience. And then it's kind of like, well, I'm just going to fall asleep on the beach and then go inside.
You're absolutely right. And that's what I mean by putting actions, into words and theories into what you're hearing from a witness or someone that might have been involved in something. Think about, my view of it is he is so key on the particulars of her being out of the water. That is a key part in all his statements. We got out of the water. She was walking in the water. She went to get her things. So his initial thought is, she's got to be out of the water, so I can assume she's okay, so I can go do what I want. And that might not be the case with this. And that's why, follow-ups and timelines and other people's accounts of how he was afterwards, we don't know if all that is true, that he went back to his room and all that. And other people's accounts of when they saw him and what's going to be said afterwards are going to be a key part in this investigation. This is a difficult one. This is really tough because of just two people being in a secluded place by themselves, and one of them's missing, and one of them gets to tell a story.
I think, too, he's still in the Dominican Republic, so he's been cooperative to the point that he hasn't gone home, which, I think there would be a concern of how that would look if he was to leave the country. But, I mean, at this point, given the statements he's given, if you're the Dominican authorities, and I know this might be more Dominican law, I mean, would he theoretically be free to go home? I mean, I'm sure at this point it's been more than a week since she went missing. Like, his spring break would have been done by now.
Yeah, I would think so. Not knowing Dominican law, but I would think so because, a person of interest doesn't mean suspect. It just means that person has an interest in the investigation because he was the last one seen with her. And that's a big distinction between suspect and just person of interest. So if it's still at that level, I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be free to go, on his own.
What are your thoughts on the Loudoun County, Virginia sheriff being the one to put out person of interest? I know they've sent deputies to help, and she's from the Washington, D.C. area. Because I think on one hand, while there's a lot of questions about his timeline and his story that he's been laying out, at the same time, it's a missing persons case. The Dominican authorities who were there are calling him a witness, but then you have the sheriff that puts out person of interest and clarified it wasn't a suspect. But I just feel like when you say person of interest, suddenly everybody's, your ears perk up and you start wondering if there's more going on here.
Absolutely right. And you got to be really careful with that, and that may have been a slip up or whatever it might have been. But when you start labeling people that are part of an investigation, you have to be very careful of what you're saying and how you're titling them. We've seen many times that backfires. Sometimes it plays out and it goes in another direction, but a lot of times it backfires and you end up, facing a lawsuit or something like that. So anyone on any law enforcement level is always very careful on how you're labeling witnesses or people of interest or suspects.
Where does this investigation go from here? He's not a suspect. He's considered a witness, maybe gave some inconsistent statements, and maybe he's just a bad witness. They were drinking that night. He doesn't remember things, and he's trying to piece together what happened. And if that's the case, and your authorities, you have this missing girl, and the last thing was seen was her just kind of walking off into the darkness, what do you do?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if the FBI gets involved or any role they may have in this, because it is a U.S. citizen missing in another country. So they do have the authority to at least look into it or start a preliminary investigation and be part of the information sharing that's going on there to see if they can have any role in that. And if they do, what is that going to be? Are they going to start interviewing people or re-interviewing people, visit the area and things like that? So it's going to be interesting to see how this progresses and if they do have an interest or a role in this going forward.
In your experience with the NYPD, have you been part of international investigations like this? I mean, I know there's a huge, many different Caribbean nations in New York City have populations where you worked.
Well, when I was in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, I ran a lot of investigations overseas with other governments and other security agencies. And for the most part, I can say we got along very well and the information sharing was always good. And I don't see any reason this wouldn't be as well. Sometimes they're guarded in what they say and it takes a little longer to get information from certain countries, sure, because they have to, keep their interests in mind as well with tourism and not putting out that there's a big problem when it comes to things like this. So I understand that part, but for my experience, working overseas in other countries, I've always had a good experience with security agencies or other government sharing information.
From what we were able to see, this was about a 50-question interview, 6 pages. All we've been able to look at is the media reports that are coming out from those who have the transcript. But of the questions that were asked, what do you make of how prosecutors and law enforcement are approaching the questions to Josh Reeby?
Yeah, I think it was methodical. I think you just go step by step in where you think it started, what you were aware of happening, and then a lot of your follow-up questions go by and are based on the answers. So you could have a lot of things written down as far as questions that you want to ask, but depending on the answer is going to fuel your next question. So I think the questions just kind of lined up with what they know at this moment and kind of leave an open door into follow-up questioning and interviews with any other information they may gather from other people or, other surveillance videos or whatever it may be, to have a follow-up interview with him.
Typically, what is the strategy that, just in your experience and being on the other side of the table, what the strategy is of an attorney to not have their client answer a question? Because at least from the peanut gallery, you see it and you're like, that's suspicious. But why would they not have him answer certain questions?
Well, whatever the case is, the attorney has to represent his client, whether you like it or not, that's his job. So if a question get asked that they hadn't gotten over, or hadn't touched on, they're going to kind of push it to the side. Oh, we're not going to answer that until the attorney understands what the answer is going to be. Most of the time, a lot of those answers, the attorney already knew what he was going to say. So if you get a question that you aren't prepared for, you're not going to have your client answer it until you speak to them and get the answer yourself before he starts talking to investigators. That's pretty common.
How long could this investigation go? I mean, as far as the attention, the FBI being involved, U.S. authorities being involved, searching a beach, looking, if she is not found, whether it's her washing ashore or maybe she's still alive and something happened that would explain everything that we have going on. But if we're still kind of in this place where we don't know where she is, there's not a lot of evidence that's coming out, the person of interest appears to, maybe he's just a bad witness, doesn't remember what happened after she left, and we're kind of still in this place. How long could this go for?
Yeah, it could just stay open. It could stay an active investigation because of what it is, or it could just be an accident. It could be a missing persons that is just a missing persons with no end time to it. It all depends on follow-up things that go on with the investigation of, is there just a flat out dead end in this? Is there no criminal activity that's being found that can lead to a furtherance of an investigation? Or is it simply an accident and she drowned and is at, in the ocean? Any of those are possible, but there's no need to quote unquote just close the case because of the time that it's open. So it could stay theoretically open for a very, very long time.
Let's keep the Konanki family in our prayers. And I will stay up on this case because something in the buttermilk is not clean. Not at all. If you go on spring break with your friends and you all are drunk, why would they let you go off with the stranger? That's one question I have. And not only let you go off with this stranger, but they take your phone, they take your belongings, and especially your phone. And as her dad said, she is never without her phone. Number 2, how did he just come back to the hotel and he didn't report what happened to anybody? He just calls himself going back to his room and go to sleep. Did her friends ask where she was? Did they see him? I mean, I need more information because this is not sounding right to me. Not at all. This sounds like another, not exactly like Shanquilla, but I don't know. It's just, to me, friends have to look out for friends when you're in, I don't care if you're in another country, when you're anywhere. I don't care if you're in the United States at a bar, anywhere. You have to look out for each other. Like, share, and subscribe.